I would like to make the case that one of the main ways that social media is causing us to lose touch with reality is through prevalence bias. Now, did I make this term up? And the answer is yes, but it comes from concepts that are in this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is one of the main books I teach from when I teach behavioral economics in class. So these concepts are real. I think prevalence bias is just a more intuitive way of thinking about it. I think people will understand the concept more intuitively with that name. Now, the simplest way to think about this concept is to imagine situations where social media pulls out specific, very outlier examples, and it shows those to us over and over again and has us thinking a lot about those examples to the point where we believe that those are more common than they really are. It manipulates our perception of how often, for example, people in our lives are judging us negatively, or how often people like us get rejected from jobs. The probabilities that make up our perception of the world we live in. There are a lot of those that I think are unduly shaped by social media to achieve its goals. And I've talked in other videos about how insecurity and stoking insecurity is a lucrative technique for social media algorithms, because when we're feeling insecure, we're more vulnerable to the products and the advertisements that are trying to sell us stuff to prop up that insecurity. So prevalence bias is a concept I think we need to be talking more about, and this video is just sort of explaining in a little more detail how this works and how it relates to behavioral economics. So here's where I'm going in the video. First, I would like to talk about intuition and irrationality, a key concept in behavioral economics. And then I'll talk about Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Then I'll connect it to what's going on social media. And finally, I'll talk about what can we do cognitively to protect ourselves from some of these manipulative tactics on social media. So first, the concept of irrationality. And this is basically our instincts. It's not rational because we're not thinking it through carefully. It's also not irrational because irrational is sort of against our own best interest. Irrational is simply instinctive. And if you've read Kahneman's book, you might associate this with the System 1 way of thinking. When I think about irrational behavior, I think about, do you flinch when someone comes in the room? And of course, whether or not you flinch depends on your past experience with the person. So the idea with irrational choices, which of course are just sort of our instincts and our reactions to things, is that they are deeply informed by our past experience. As a matter of fact, they're deeply informed in a way that could actually mirror rationality. Like if we have a very negative reaction and someone is kind of violent, when they walk in the room, maybe flinching and sort of getting our guards up automatically is the best response from a rational standpoint. But our brains just sort of do that automatically. And of course, economic models are originally built around the idea of rationality, where you're weighing costs and benefits. Basically, irrational models are models where you look at the costs and benefits that people have personally experienced in their lives as they shape those instincts, and you predict what is going to be their instinctive reaction. So the basic idea with irrational models is that it's mapping the rational cost-benefit models onto our irrational instincts. Now, of course, our instincts are going to have a really big effect on how we feel from a day-to-day standpoint. And I think when we think about how we interact with social media, a lot of our reactions on social media, do we click? Do we stay there and watch the whole video? Do we hit the like button? A lot of these are much more close to an irrational decision than a rational decision. We're not sitting there thinking through the costs and benefits of hitting the like button or clicking that next video. We're just sort of reacting. Now, another useful concept from behavioral economics here is going to be salience. And salience is basically how much we pay attention to something in our lives. Because when we're weighing different costs and benefits, we tend to overweigh things that we pay a lot of attention to. And of course, this is the whole deal with advertising. Advertisers try to get us to think more about something, place greater salience on something. Like if it's insurance, that the advertisers are going to place greater salience on getting your car broken into, because if you've thought about that more, when you're thinking about how much am I going to pay for insurance, the cost of getting your car broken into and sort of the emotional weight based on all of the advertisements you've seen is going to weigh more heavily, which will drive up how much you're willing to pay. So salience is just an importance weight that you're placing on something based on how much attention you give it. And of course, the whole model with social media is channeling your attention in ways that are beneficial to advertisers. And in some ways, prevalence bias could be considered salience bias. I just like the term prevalence bias because I think it's more intuitive. Now, a lot of what this book talks about is biases in our perception of probabilities. And essentially, when you think about the importance weight you're placing on any given cost or benefit and the probability that it will happen, those two things kind of get enmeshed in our intuition when we're making decisions. So if something is very salient to you, you will either estimate a higher probability, or else you'll just weigh it more heavily in decision making, which is essentially the same thing when you're talking about manipulation of people's consumer behavior. And of course, things are more salient when they're easier to visualize. For example, one thing he talks about in here is which one is going to be more salient. If you tell people 1 in 10 people experience this, or 10% of people experience this. And 1 in 10 people, you can kind of visualize, oh, a person, and you can kind of visualize 10 people lined up, and one of those is going to experience car theft or whatever. So by framing things in a certain way that makes them more salient, more vivid, using brighter colors, using bolder texts, using more emotional language, that makes things more salient, which is going to lead it to have a heavier weight in your attention and therefore your decision making. That's a quick and dirty overview of some of the behavioral economics concepts that relate to this. Now, how does social media manipulate our salience or manipulate our perception of how prevalent things are? Well, let me work with an example to explain some of this. So let's say there's a fast food company that catches some of its workers spitting on the hamburgers before they give them to customers. That's pretty gross. If you get footage of workers spitting on hamburgers and then laughing at customers who eat them, that's going to get people riled up. That's the exact kind of content that's likely to go viral because it sort of evokes a disgust response. People are going to share it and be like, ooh, watch out next time you go to this fast food chain. There's a little bit of a viral nature to that kind of content on social media. Now, this example is actually going to be one that I don't think would ever happen to go viral because it's damaging to the corporate world, and I do think there's a little bit of collusion between different large corporations. I explained that in another video, but whether or not you believe that is not important for this video. The key here is that the algorithms, I mean, they optimize for profit, they optimize for engagement, and the kind of content that is going to engage us is this content that evokes strong emotion, like you might experience if you watched those workers spitting on the hamburger. However, that's not the only tool social media uses. The fact that it can take 1 or 2 examples of workers spitting on a hamburger and kind of magnify them because you see those examples perhaps taken from different angles, you hear about them over and over in a way that kind of makes it seem like even though this only happened twice, we only have video footage of 2 instances where teenage boys spit on hamburgers. Because it's talked about so much, it feels like it is a common thing, like it is a pattern. So you can easily imagine next time you're trying to decide where am I going to go to eat, you're not going to go to a place where they serve hamburgers. Now, that is completely irrational because this is 2 examples, so the probability that you will get your hamburger spit on is not very high at all. But because it's so salient, because it passes around the social media feeds, and because there's so much commentary on it, it sort of makes it seem like a big deal, you perceive danger anytime you think about eating a hamburger at a fast food restaurant. Now, there's other techniques social media algorithms I think are going to use to sort of magnify this phenomenon, but I will talk about that in another video. Now, the other thing here is that this isn't just about the outrageous. It isn't just about the things that we focus on, that we talk about. I think a lot of what's going on with social media is that it's shaping our intuitions about other people's perceptions of us. So if you take my premise that you are more likely to click on ads and be vulnerable to advertising when you are feeling insecure, then the algorithms can make us feel more insecure by trying to create a perception that other people judging us is way more prevalent than it actually is. And that's actually kind of easy to do on social media because we don't know what's going on in people's heads, but we know that the comments people make on social media, those seem like the private comments that are going on in everybody's head. It seems like a window into what are other people thinking about people like me. And if you develop your intuition about how do other people judge me based on these probabilities that are susceptible to prevalence bias on social media, that is majorly going to stoke insecurity. So the question is, what can we actually do about this? If we believe that the cues and the perception of our world that we're getting from social media is biased by all of the tools it has to sort of elevate our intuition about the likelihood of certain horrible events or horrible things happening or shaming things happening, what do we do about it? I think the first step here is going to be aware of what are the things that really bother us. What are the things we fear the most? What are the things about the way other people perceive us, the things we think are going on inside other people's heads that bother us the most? And just being aware for us personally, what is that? Because the social media algorithms probably have an intuitive sense for what that is. I mean, obviously the algorithms don't know, but the algorithms probably know the kinds of content that tap into those very things, the things that get at you most. And then for those things, asking yourself, what is the actual probability of this being the case? And what are the ways that my news feed, that my social media feed, and the people I interact with are going to heighten the salience of these things, are going to heighten my sense of the probability that this is a real threat to me. Now, I do want to say one thing, which is not the most hopeful way to end this video, but I do think that sometimes the sense of threat that social media provokes in people can actually create a self-fulfilling prophecy, especially in a world where there's sort of 2 groups who fear each other. Because when you feel anxiety about another group of people, you start to fear them. Sometimes you try to manage that anxiety by neutralizing that group, taking away rights from that group, and you actually then become a threat to that group. So if that group is afraid of you, your management of your own anxiety can be used to heighten their sense of threat about you. And that can sort of lead to this escalating threat cycle that where both groups are trying to neutralize the dangers that they perceive of each other, and that can actually become real. So I don't want to say that every sense of threat or anxiety that you see on social media has no basis. I don't think that's the case. But at the same time, I think it is very important to be careful about when you perceive a group to be a threat, counterbalancing that sense of threat from that group with what are examples of people in that group who are not a threat. And the most likely situation is that most people in that group are not a threat. So I guess this would be the other way of managing this is, especially if it's a group of people that you feel fearful about. You probably see the absolute worst cherry-picked examples that sort of demonstrate behaviors that you think are common among that group. If you focus instead on what are the people in that group who are great people who also hate those horrible examples, you're going to see a more accurate picture, or you're going to have a more accurate sense for what is that group all about. So maybe another thing to do here would be, if there is a group of people that you feel threatened by based on something that you're seeing on social media, do you know anyone in that group personally? And what do they think about those horrible outlier examples? That would be another way of counteracting this. So that's just an introduction to a concept that I think we need to be talking more about, and we need to be using more when we manage our own cognitive space in terms of how we understand the truth about the world.